He parted the Red Sea. He stood before Pharaoh, the most powerful man on earth, and refused to back down. He climbed a mountain wrapped in lightning and smoke and came back down with the law of God carved in stone. He spoke to God face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. He interceded for a nation so rebellious that God himself wanted to destroy them, and he talked God out of it. He did all of this. And then, after 40 years of leading one of the most difficult groups of people in human history through one of the most inhospitable places on earth, after a lifetime of obedience, sacrifice, and faithfulness that is almost impossible to comprehend, he made one mistake. And God told him, "You will not enter the promised land. Not you will be disciplined. Not you will enter late. Not you will enter with reduced honor. You will not enter. You will climb to the top of the mountain, look across at the land I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and you will see it. And then you will die on the wrong side of the border, after everything, for one mistake." The disproportion of this judgment has troubled readers of the Bible for thousands of years. It has troubled rabbis who have debated it across centuries of commentary. It has troubled theologians who have tried to reconcile it with a God who is described as slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. It has troubled ordinary people who read it and feel something that is hard to name, a kind of vertigo at the edge of divine holiness. What did Moses do? The answer is recorded in the book of Numbers. It takes less than a paragraph to describe. And yet the more carefully you look at it, the more you realize that what happened at the waters of Meribah was not a small thing dressed up as a large thing. It was the outward expression of something that had been building for a long time, something that went much deeper than a single moment of anger, something that touches the most fundamental questions about who Moses was, what his relationship with God required of him, and what it means to represent the God of Israel to a watching world. Leave a 777 inches the comments if you are ready to go deeper than any Sunday school lesson has ever taken you on this story, because what you are about to hear will change the way you read the entire life of Moses. To understand the sin at Meribah, we have to understand Moses. Not the Hollywood version, not the stained glass version, the actual human being that the biblical text shows us, complicated, gifted, broken, faithful, and ultimately limited in ways that the narrative does not flinch from showing. Moses is introduced in Exodus as a man formed by contradiction. He is a Hebrew child raised in Pharaoh's palace. He is an insider who is actually an outsider. He is a prince who identifies with slaves. And his first recorded act as an adult tells us everything about who he is before God gets hold of him. He sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. He looks around to see if anyone is watching, and he kills the Egyptian and buries the body in the sand. This is Moses before the burning bush. A man of justice, a man of passion, a man who sees wrong and cannot walk past it, but also a man who acts impulsively, who covers up what he has done, who flees when his action has consequences he did not anticipate. He runs. He goes to Midian. He sits by a well. He meets Zipporah. He builds a life. And for 40 years, the man who was supposed to lead Israel does nothing of the kind. He tends sheep. He raises children. He disappears into the ordinary rhythms of a life that has no apparent destiny left in it. And then the burning bush. God appears to Moses in the wilderness in a fire that does not consume the bush it burns in, and God speaks. He tells Moses who he is, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He tells Moses what he has seen, the affliction of his people in Egypt, and he tells Moses what he is going to do, bring them out of Egypt into a land flowing with milk and honey. And then he says, "I am sending you to Pharaoh." Moses' response to this divine commission is one of the most relatable moments in the entire Bible. He does not say yes immediately. He does not fall on his face in reverent submission. He argues. He asks questions. He raises objections. Who am I to go to Pharaoh? What if they don't believe me? I am not eloquent. I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. Please send someone else. Please send someone else. This is the man at the burning bush, not the confident deliverer of later tradition, a man who has spent 40 years thinking of himself as a failure, a fugitive, a has-been. A man who has so thoroughly given up on the idea that he could be anything significant that even a direct divine commission delivered from a supernatural fire does not immediately convince him. God answers every objection. He provides signs. He promises to be with him. He assigns Aaron as a spokesman. He patient with Moses' reluctance in a way that is remarkable and that we should note because it tells us something about how God views this man, even when this man views himself as inadequate. God is committed to Moses. He has chosen him specifically. And this commitment will prove to be both the greatest gift of Moses' life and, in some ways, the weight that makes his final failure so devastating. The plagues of Egypt are the story of a direct confrontation between the God of Israel and the gods of Egypt. Each plague targets a specific deity in the Egyptian pantheon, demonstrating the impotence of the divine order that Pharaoh represents and embodies. And Moses is the man in the middle, the spokesperson, the instrument, the human face of divine power in a context of maximum political and spiritual tension. 10 times Pharaoh refuses, 10 times the plagues escalate, 10 times Moses returns and delivers the message, and through all of it, Moses himself grows. The reluctant, self-doubting shepherd from Midian becomes something else. He becomes the man who stands before the most powerful ruler of the ancient world and says what God tells him to say, again and again, without flinching. This is the formation of Moses. It happens in the crucible of repeated confrontation, repeated rejection, repeated escalation. And by the time Israel crosses the Red Sea, by the time Moses raises his staff and the waters part and the nation walks across on dry ground, and the Egyptian army is swallowed behind them by that time, something has been forged in Moses that is genuinely extraordinary. But the Red Sea is not the end. It is the beginning of what will prove to be the most difficult assignment in Moses' life. Leading a freed nation of slaves through the wilderness is harder than confronting Pharaoh. Because Pharaoh is one man with one will and one agenda, a nation of slaves just released from generations of bondage is something else entirely. It is a mass of people who have been conditioned for their entire lives to have no agency, no choice, no voice, and now they have all three, and they do not always use them well. The wilderness is where the people grumble. It is where they complain about water and food and leadership and the unbearable heat and the memory of Egypt, which they begin, almost immediately, to romanticize. The Egypt of memory becomes the Egypt of abundance, the fish and the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. They forget the slavery. They remember the food. They say to Moses, "Why did you bring us out here to die?" And Moses bears this. For 40 years, he bears this. He goes up the mountain to receive the law and comes down to find them dancing around a golden calf they have made in his absence. He smashes the tablets. He intercedes for the people before God. He goes back up the mountain. He comes back down. He deals with the aftermath. He deals with Korah's rebellion. When 250 leaders of the community rise up against him and say, "Who are you to set yourself above the assembly of the Lord?" He deals with the report of the spies that sends the nation into panic and condemns an entire generation to die in the wilderness without ever seeing the promised land. He deals with Aaron and Miriam challenging his authority. He deals with the constant, grinding, daily weight of a people who complain about everything, who doubt everything, who rebel against everything, and who in their better moments follow God, but in their worse moments seem constitutionally incapable of sustained faithfulness. And through all of this, Moses intercedes. Again and again he stands between the people and God's anger. When God says, "I will destroy them and make a great nation of you," Moses says no. He argues for the people he is exhausted by. He pleads for them. He even says at one point, "If you will not forgive them, blot me out of your book." Blot me out. He is willing to die in their place. He is willing to have his own name erased from the record of the living if it means the people are preserved. This is the Moses who arrives at the waters of Meribah. Now we come to the moment. Numbers 20. The waters of Meribah, the sin that costs Moses the promised land. The Israelites arrive at Kadesh, and there is no water. The community gathers against Moses and Aaron, and they quarrel with him. They say, "Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness for us and our livestock to die here? Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs or grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." This is, by any count, approximately the 10,000th time the people have said something like this to Moses. He has been hearing versions of this complaint since Egypt. He has answered it with water from a rock before in Exodus 17, at a place also called Meribah. God told him to strike the rock with his staff, and water came out. He has seen God provide again and again for people who grumble and doubt and complain and then receive the provision they doubted was coming and then start the cycle all over again. Moses and Aaron go to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fall on their faces. The glory of God appears, and God speaks. "Take the staff. You and Aaron your brother assemble the congregation. Speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water." The instruction is specific. Take the staff. Assemble the congregation. Speak to the rock. Speak to it. Moses takes the staff. He assembles the congregation before the rock, and then he speaks, but not to the rock. He speaks to the people. "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" And then he raises his staff, and he strikes the rock twice. Water comes out in abundance. The congregation drinks. The livestock drink. The immediate crisis is resolved exactly as God promised it would be. But God speaks again, and this time the words are not provision, they are judgment. "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this congregation into the land I give them." That is the verdict. After everything, because of this. Now we need to ask the question that every honest reader of this passage is forced to ask. What exactly was the sin? Because, on the surface, it is not obvious. Moses struck the rock instead of speaking to it. He called the people rebels. He said, "Must we bring you water," using "we" instead of God, possibly claiming the miracle for himself. He struck the rock twice instead of once. Which of these was the sin? Or was it all of them together? The rabbis have debated this for 2,000 years and have not reached a consensus, which tells us something important. The text is deliberately withholding a simple answer. It is not showing us a checklist of violations and pointing to the one that triggered the judgment. It is showing us a moment and letting us sit with the terrible disproportion of what followed. But God's own words give us the key. He says, "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy." The sin was a failure of holiness, a failure to represent God accurately to a watching nation. Let us unpack this carefully, because it is the most important thing in the entire story. Moses was not just a leader. He was not just an administrator or a general or a political figure. He was the mediator between God and Israel. He was the man through whom God chose to reveal himself to his people and through his people to the world. Everything Moses did in his public role was a statement about who God is. When God said, "Speak to the rock," he was not simply choosing a method of water extraction. He was orchestrating a revelation. He was going to show the people something about himself through this act. The rock would produce water not because it was struck, not because force was applied, but because it was spoken to. Because the word of God is enough. Because God's command alone, without violence, without compulsion, brings forth what is needed. This was the lesson. The God of Israel provides not through power applied with human force, but through the word spoken in divine authority. Speak to the rock. Watch what happens. See who your God is. Moses did not give them that lesson. He gave them a different one. He struck the rock with force, twice, in anger. And he said, "Must we bring you water?" pulling the attention to himself and Aaron rather than to God. The people got their water, but they did not get the revelation they were supposed to get. They saw an angry man hitting a rock. They did not see the gentle, commanding sufficiency of God's word producing abundance from stone. Moses misrepresented God in public. To the nation he was called to shepherd in the ways of the Lord. This is the sin. Not disobedience for its own sake, not rule-breaking, misrepresentation. And for a man in Moses' role, misrepresentation of God is not a small thing. But we need to go deeper still, because the question the text forces us to ask is not just what did Moses do, it is why. What was happening inside him that produced this moment? The chapter begins with a detail that is easy to miss. Numbers 20:1 says, "The people of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month. And the people stayed in Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried there." Miriam died, Moses' sister, the woman who had stood at the edge of the Nile as a child and watched the basket carrying her baby brother drift toward Pharaoh's daughter, ready to suggest a nurse for the child if the princess decided to keep him. The woman who led the women of Israel in song and dance after the Red Sea crossing, his sister. One of the only people who had been with him from the very beginning, who knew who he had been before the burning bush, who shared the history of Egypt and Midian and the impossible assignment. Miriam died, and the text says nothing about Moses mourning her. It moves directly to the water crisis, as if the death of his sister and the complaint of the people are sequential events without emotional space between them. But there was space, and in that space, grief. Moses was not a machine. He was a man who had just buried his sister, a man who had been doing this for 40 years, a man who was old. He was 80 when he left Egypt, which means he is now approaching 120. A man who had interceded for these people again and again and again, who had sacrificed his own comfort and peace and security for them, who had spoken to God on their behalf when God wanted to destroy them. And now they are at it again. No water. The same complaint, the same accusation. Why did you bring us here to die? And something broke, not permanently, not catastrophically, but in that moment, at that rock, with the grief of Miriam still raw and the exhaustion of 40 years pressing down on him and the people doing what they always do, something in Moses gave way. He was angry, not righteously angry, humanly, exhaustedly, finally, completely angry. "Listen, you rebels." He had never called them that before. Not to their faces, not in that tone. He had interceded for them when God called them stiff-necked. He had pled for them when God wanted to destroy them. But he had never stood before them and said, "You rebels," as if he had given up on them. And he struck the rock, twice, as if the first strike hadn't been enough, as if he needed to hit something. This is Moses at the end of himself. a man of extraordinary faithfulness and extraordinary endurance who, in one terrible moment, let the accumulated weight of 40 years of human limitation pour through him in a way that was real and understandable and deeply human and completely wrong. There is a question that the ancient Jewish tradition raises about this moment that is worth sitting with. The question is, was Moses' punishment too severe? The rabbis who asked this question were not questioning God's justice. They were wrestling with it. They were sitting in the tension that every honest reader of this passage must sit in. The tension between Moses' extraordinary life of faithfulness and this single moment of failure, and the severity of the consequence. Some rabbis argued that Moses must have sinned more than the text explicitly records. They looked for additional transgressions in the story, the anger, the claiming of the miracle for himself, the striking twice, and tried to pile them up until the punishment seemed proportionate. Others argued the opposite, that precisely because Moses was Moses, the standard was higher, that the greater the gift, the greater the responsibility to use it faithfully. That a man who had stood on the mountain and seen the glory of God, who had spoken with God face to face, who had been given more direct access to divine revelation than any human being in history, such a man had less excuse for misrepresenting God than an ordinary Israelite would have had. To whom much is given, much is required. Moses had been given more than anyone, and so the threshold of what counted as failure was correspondingly higher. But there is another tradition, one that adds a dimension that changes the emotional register of the story entirely. This tradition does not try to make Moses' punishment feel proportionate. It sits with the disproportion and finds within it something that is not cruelty but tragedy. The tragedy of a great man who came so close, who gave so much, who served so faithfully for so long, and who in the end could not quite carry the weight of what he was called to be, all the way to the finish line. The Promised Land was not just a geographic destination. For Moses, it was the culmination of everything, the moment when the promise to Abraham would begin to be visibly, tangibly fulfilled, the moment when the wandering would end, the moment when the people he had shepherded through the wilderness would finally arrive at the place God had promised their ancestors, and he would not be there for it. He would see it. God would show it to him from the mountain. He would stand on Nebo and look across the Jordan and see the land spread out before him. He would see it and die without setting foot in it. This is a tragedy in the classical sense, not a story of a bad man brought low by his vices, a story of a great man brought low by the very human limitations that his greatness could not overcome. There is a moment in Deuteronomy that most people read quickly and move past. That is, when you slow down and look at it, one of the most heartbreaking passages in the entire Bible. Moses is delivering his final speech to Israel. He is recounting the wilderness years. He is giving the law one more time to a generation that did not receive it at Sinai. And he mentions Meribah. He says, "The Lord was angry with me because of you and swore that I would not cross the Jordan and enter the good land the Lord your God is giving you as your inheritance. I will die in this land. I will not cross the Jordan. But you are about to cross over and take possession of that good land because of you." Moses says the Lord was angry with me because of you. He places the responsibility on the people. Their rebellion, their complaints, their relentless difficulty. He points to this as the context of his failure. Scholars debate how to interpret this. Some say Moses is deflecting blame. Some say he is accurately describing the circumstance, if not the cause, that the people's provocation was the context, even if his response to that provocation was his own responsibility. But there is another reading, a reading that does not see Moses as deflecting but as mourning. Because of you is not an accusation, it is a lament. He is saying, Look at what this cost. Look at what 40 years of carrying your rebellion cost me. I loved you enough to intercede for you when God wanted to destroy you. I sacrificed my own comfort and security and peace for you. And in the end, at Meribah, with Miriam just buried, and no water again, and the same complaint again, I broke. And it cost me the one thing I had been walking toward all my life. Because of you. Not you are to blame, but look at what this cost. This is the lament of a shepherd who gave everything for his flock and paid the final price for that giving in the moment when he had nothing left to give. God's response to Moses after the pronouncement of judgment is itself deeply significant. He does not abandon Moses. He does not cast him aside. He continues to speak with him. He gives him his final assignments, the commissioning of Joshua, the final speeches of Deuteronomy, the song of Moses, the blessing of the tribes. And at the very end, God takes Moses up to the top of Mount Nebo, and he shows him the land. All of it, Gilead, Dan, Naphtali, Ephraim, Manasseh, Judah, the Negev, the plain of the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zoar. He shows him everything, the whole land, the whole promise. And Deuteronomy 34:5 says simply, "And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. The Lord buried him, God himself, in a valley in Moab opposite Beth Peor, and no one knows where his grave is to this day." No one knows where Moses is buried. God buried him and kept the location secret, and the ancient tradition has speculated about why. Some say it was to prevent the Israelites from making his grave a place of worship, from turning Moses himself into an idol. Some say it was an act of mercy, a private burial for a very public man. Some say it was simply the last act of divine intimacy, the God who spoke to Moses face to face, as a man speaks with his friend, attending to him at the end with the same personal closeness. And then the text says something that no other figure in the Hebrew Bible is said of them. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. No one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. No one like him, before or since, the man who could not enter the promised land, the man who was kept out by one moment of failure after a lifetime of faithfulness, the man whose sin cost him everything. No one like him. What does this story mean? What is it saying to us across the distance of 3,000 years? It is saying several things simultaneously, and they are in tension with each other in the way that the deepest truths always are. First, it is saying that the standard for those who represent God is absolute. Moses was not held to a higher standard because God was looking for an excuse to punish him. He was held to a higher standard because his role required it. He was the mediator, the spokesman, the one through whom Israel understood who their God was. When you represent God, how you represent him matters infinitely. The moment at Meribah was not just Moses losing his temper. It was Moses giving Israel a false picture of God in a moment when they desperately needed a true one. Second, it is saying that proximity to God does not immunize you against failure. Moses had been closer to God than any human being in the biblical record. He had seen the glory, he had heard the voice, he had received the law, and none of it made him incapable of a moment of catastrophic human failure. This is sobering. It should make anyone who has had genuine encounters with God humble about their own capacity for failure. Third, it is saying that consequences are real. Moses' failure had consequences. They were severe. They were permanent in this life. God did not reverse them because Moses had been faithful for 40 years. The faithfulness was real. The failure was also real. Both existed simultaneously, and God held both with perfect justice and perfect mercy. Fourth, it is saying that the story does not end where it seems to end. Because there is a moment in the New Testament that the Moses story has been pointing toward all along, and it changes everything about how we read his exclusion from the Promised Land. In Matthew 17, on a mountain in Galilee, Jesus is transfigured before his disciples. His face shines like the sun. His garments become white as light. And two figures appear with him, talking with him, Moses and Elijah. Moses, standing in the land, on the mountain, talking with the one who will be revealed as the fulfillment of everything the law of Moses pointed toward. He could not enter the promised land in the wilderness generation, but he entered the presence of the one who is the greater than the promised land. He who was kept out of Canaan stood with the one who said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." He who struck the rock in anger stood with the one who is the rock from which living water flows. The rabbis debated for centuries whether Moses would enter the promised land in the age to come. The New Testament answers the question not with an argument, but with a vision. There he is, on the mountain, with Jesus. The one sin that kept him from the land could not keep him from the one the land was always pointing to. What should we take from this? We should take the sobering truth that how we represent God matters, that the closer we are called to him, the higher the standard. That faithfulness over a long time does not guarantee faithfulness in every single moment, and that single moments can have consequences that long faithfulness cannot undo in this life. We should take the humbling truth that the greatest figures of faith were also broken people. That Moses, who interceded for Israel and argued with God and led a nation through impossible terrain, was also a man who broke under pressure at the end of a very long road. That the same man who said, "Blot me out of your book for their sake," was the man who called them rebels and struck the rock in anger. Both were Moses. Neither cancels out the other. We should take the extraordinary comfort that the God who kept Moses from the promised land also buried him with his own hands in an unknown grave and called him his servant and said, "No one has risen like him," and eventually brought him to the mountain to stand with his son. The judgment was real. The grace was also real. Both were true simultaneously. And we should take, perhaps above everything else, the urgent awareness that our moments matter, that there are moments in a life when everything that has been built across years of faithfulness is tested in a single instant, that the accumulation of good decisions does not make the next decision automatic, that Moses, who had done so much right, still had a moment that was wrong, and that the God who held him accountable for that moment is the same God who showed him the land from the mountain, who buried him with care, who brought him to the transfiguration. The God who judges is the God who loves. The God who kept Moses out of Canaan is the God who brought him to the mountain with Jesus. This is not comfortable theology. It is not the theology of easy grace that costs nothing. It is the theology of a God who is genuinely holy and genuinely merciful simultaneously, and who does not allow either attribute to cancel out the other. Moses lived that tension to the very end, and his story invites us to live in it too, with humility, with sobriety, with the urgent awareness that our moments matter, and with the hope grounded not in our own faithfulness, but in the faithfulness of the one Moses stood with on the mountain, that the final word is not Meribah. The final word is the transfiguration. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Has this story changed how you see Moses? How you see the justice and mercy of God held together? Subscribe for more explorations into the figures of Scripture that the church has flattened into symbols when they were actually people like us, who gave much, failed once, and found grace on the other side. Until next time.